It's finally time to explore the details of the most lovely dress in the live-action Cinderella movie. So yes, I do love the ball gown. As you might notice from my channel, there's a lot of videos about that one. The ball gown is just like amazing and massive and downright the most incredible dress design in history, in my opinion. But there is a costume that is just as lovely and amazing and just honestly so pretty. I think I love it more than her ball gown. If that's possible, that's her work dress. You first see it after her mother dies, and then it's the dress that she continues to wear for most of the rest of the movie. I am in the works of replicating this dress, and I have been wanting to make it for such a long time, and it's finally happening, and I'm bringing all of you along with me. So let's just dive right into the details. So first up, the chemise. So this tan cream bit peeping up at the neckline is the chemise, I'm pretty sure. You see it move about a bit depending on the scene, which means it's not attached to the actual dress, and hence my chemise assumption. The fabric is slightly sheer and appears to have a soft drape. The neckline is visible around the entire neckline, and it has a tiny rolled hem. In that hem, there is a thin string which loosely gathers up that neckline, and then it ties in the front. It looks like it's a satin type string. Because the entire sleeve you can tell is the sheer fabric of the actual dress, this would mean that the chemise doesn't have any sleeves to it, because you would then see it, so it's a sleeveless chemise. We not only get a glimpse of the top of the chemise, but possibly we get a look at the bottom of it, maybe. In this scene, we see a cream skirt. It's the same color as the top of the chemise, but it's a pretty full skirt, and chemises usually don't have a ton of fabric to it because a chemise is supposed to be worn under the corset. The skirt could be part of the chemise, or it's just an extra petticoat. Based on the movement and wrinkles of this skirt, we see the circumference is probably around 4 yards. And as I'm thinking about it more, there appears to be more evidence of this skirt being just a separate petticoat and not part of the chemise. With how the skirt is falling and when you get a good glimpse of that hem, it appears to have a straight grain edge. The hem is falling straight, which means it's probably a rectangle piece of fabric gathered up at the top, and the bottom edge is hemmed, and that's what we're seeing. If this skirt was a gored skirt, you would see some curve to that hemmed edge. And if this skirt was attached to the chemise, in order to get enough width down at the hem, it would have to be a gored skirt. That was kind of a roundabout way of saying I don't really know what this is, but it's probably a petticoat. Quick insert here, you might have seen this photo and wondered what it was. For one, it is not the chemise. It's the same outer dress design. It's got all the details, but it does have some different looking areas in the pleats at the front, and the hem looks like it's just like been quickly turned up. But also you can see the chemise peeking out around the neckline. Most probably this is a mock-up of the dress. So mock-up is really important to get all the details correct before moving on to the real fabric and making the real thing. On to the next item of clothing you would put on, the corset. We've got no photos of the actual item, except the fact that Sandy Powell said the same corset was worn under the ball gown and the work dress. So we do have these few photos of Lily's dance double, Flick Swan, and the corset she's wearing under the ball gown. So this corset would, based on Sandy Powell, be worn with this work dress, and this corset would be worn over the chemise. Onto the underskirt. We see the skirt in a few scenes, but the most notable is the horse riding scene. Because this outer skirt is sheer, you can tell there's an underlayer under that sheer fabric. You can also see the hem ending here at different places. At first I thought it was just this blue underskirt, the very obvious blue skirt here. But then I noticed these little details peeking out at the bottom. There's an extra bit of ruffled fabric underneath that blue skirt that is obviously not the visible blue skirt. You see the smooth laying blue hem, and then that bit of extra gather is under that. So this would mean there are 2 blue underskirts. So it wasn't uncommon in historical fashion to wear multiple petticoats in order to achieve a full skirt, and since Sandy Powell based all her designs in historical fashion, it kind of all adds up. So the under one is just another petticoat, made in a similar fashion probably to the cream petticoat. It's just kind of hard to tell, but it is most probably just a basic cotton fabric and petticoat design. Now we're actually just gonna move on to the outer dress. because I am pretty sure this very visible blue layer is the lining of the dress and not a separate skirt petticoat. So let's first address this underlining because we're on that topic. The very outer fabric of the dress is sheer, but the bodice and the main part of the skirt is not visibly sheer, and that's thanks to the lining of the dress. So the bodice is lined, but the lining fabric is not in this pleated section at the front. Having the lining in those pleats would make it all very bulky, and then you can also tell in the wrinkles at the bust that it's just the sheer fabric in those wrinkles and the underlining is smooth underneath. This lining is not sheer and has a thicker drape to it. I would guess it's just a basic combed cotton fabric, and it's slightly more of a aquish blue. It just has a bit more of a greenish tint to it compared to the outer dress, and it's also a little bit of a lighter shade of blue. As for the skirt lining, most of the time it's laying smooth under the outer skirt. Both are kind of moving as one, so this would mean that there's the same amount of fabric on both of those layers. And it's the same pattern. Something to notice at the hem, it's a pretty thick hem. It's probably turned over about 2.5 inches, and it appears to be hand sewn in place, or it could be a blind hem stitch. Moving on to the skirt pleats. They are most probably cartridge pleats. How those work is the skirt fabric is folded back and forth like so, and then the bodice edge is lined up to one edge of the folds, and then you do a hand sewn whip stitch securing those folded edges to the bodice edge. So what happens is when it's finished, you have the bodice, and then the skirt kind of sticks out like this because those top folds are sewn to the bodice. But then that second edge of folds is kind of just hanging loose and helps push the skirt up a little more directly out instead of lying flat. Also, this method makes fitting a bunch of fabric into the waistband much less bulky because you aren't trying to get the entire edge of the fabric worked into one area of the waistband. It kind of like is hanging some of it out, so to speak. Anyway, back to the lining fabric. The cartridge pleats are very fine, and also looking at this photo, there is a color difference between the bodice, which is lined, and the skirt pleats. If the lining was in those pleats, one, they would be thicker, and two, they wouldn't have much of a color difference because they both are backed by the same fabric. I'm going to do some experimentation with fabric and such and just see what works as far as putting the lining in those pleats or just having the sheer fabric in the pleats. We'll find out. Anyway, I think that's all for the under parts of the dress, and we can move on to the very visible part of this beautiful dress. After ordering a lot of different options of this fabric, it's very hard to find a sheer fabric that once it's blue, it's still sheer. A lot of my options were sheer enough when they were white, but once I dyed them the blue I wanted, they didn't quite cut it. I mostly tried different types of cotton voile because that seems the best option, but the main problem with cotton voile often is it's really crisp and stiff. Some are better than others, and I did find one that was a softer voile. Another option is cotton wool. Cotton wool, is that how you say it? I think. Anyway, it's a hard fabric to find, but it is very soft and sheer, even more sheer than voile, I would say. I will put the links for those fabrics that I think will work down below in the description. Of course, the fabric is not only a lovely blue aqua color, but it also has these printed designs on all of it. There's a repeat design across all the fabric, bodice, sleeves, everything. They are spaced about 3 inches apart from each other. And then of course, we've got these large floral arrangements going up the skirt. There are 7 repeats of this design, and the small flowers and these large ones are all coral colored with a darker coral, a lighter almost cream color, and then some green. Now, if this wasn't enough of printing on the fabric that needs to be done, there's also a border on the skirt. It's a darker aqua blue and it's in sort of a leaf design. The process for getting these prints on the fabric will be explored as I actually make my replica, so we'll just talk about that more as this journey continues. There's just going to be some designing of those floral arrangements and figuring out a way to get them on the fabric without creating stiffness to the fabric, because that is one thing you don't see. These areas with the prints are not like stiffer, and you can just kind of tell if they were. So they are more of a dye to the fabric, or they're just a very soft paint applied. But anyway, we're going to talk about that more as we continue this journey. Onto the outer skirt design. So we've already talked about the cartridge pleats, But I also want to point out that this 1.5 inches or so below the waist stays pleated. You don't ever see this section of pleats like opening up. It's under that 1.5 inches or so that it opens up. So this means that the very top is gathered, but also the other inch or so is kept gathered. So this would mean multiple threads gathering up all those pleats and then those threads staying in there to keep that area all gathered. For the hem, it's a very small rolled hem, not as tiny as an 1/8 inch, but not a 1/4 inch. So I guess it's like 3/16, and it appears to be hand sewn. As for the width of the skirt, this twirling seam is a great way to see how full everything is, and I would guess the circumference is about 5 yards. But we'll see as I make this dress. It's easier to tell with the actual fabric in person to see if that's the right proportion as far as width and stuff. Onto the bodice. So the front section is pleated up or smocked. At the bottom, those pleats are very tight, and then it slowly loosens up as it goes up towards the bust. At the underbust line, the smocking stops, and what we've got is those nice gathers going over the bust. So the floral print and those bust gathers give us a great idea of how much fabric is gathered up in all those pleats. So we see there are 7 flowers across that front gathered piece and the same amount in the pleats. I counted all the pleats and I got 110 to 112 based on the estimation of how far apart each flower print is. The width of the fabric is going to be about 23 to 24 inches, and then divided into those 112 pleats, we're looking at about 1/8 inch pleats. The front of the bodice slopes down at the waist to form a slight point, but at the back it's straight. My guess is there is a seam right here along the gathered and the straight area of the bodice. There's a side seam, a curved seam at the back, and then the shoulder seam is sloped towards the back, which is actually a very standard thing in historical designs. The closure is at the center back with hooks and eyes. The outer flap of this closure is always smooth and you really never see it wrinkle, which means it probably has a piece of boning up that back flap area. Onto more details of the bodice, but before we go on, I'm going to share some awesome up-close photos of the dress that were sent to me by Sarah. So thank you very much for doing that, Sarah. I very much appreciate it. Along the neckline, there's a little ruffle attached, and this has a tiny hem, but it does look like it's machine stitched in place, so yay. Also attached along the neckline is a fine coral piping. This piping is also along the armhole and the waist. Sidetrack, look at this. It looks like it's ribbon tying up the chemise edge, yet in the other photo I found, it's definitely like a satin string. So hey, just goes to prove that you never know with movie costumes what you're gonna find, because you don't know which of the many they made you're actually looking at this certain time. Moving on to the sleeves. They are full length, I'm pretty sure, but they are always rolled up to 3/4 length. In this photo, we can see the hem of the sleeve, and it appears to have a vent in that bottom edge, and you don't see any buttons, so it's probably that there's just that vent there to allow the sleeve to get rolled up. At the top of the sleeve, we've got an interesting detail. It's almost a smocking detail, but very loosely done. So you definitely see the threads. There are 10 lines of the threads, and the stitches look to be about 1/8 inch long. And with that, I think the main details of this dress have been discovered, or currently been discovered. We'll probably discover more as I actually make the thing, but at this certain point in time, this is my understanding of the dress. But I'm not done yet. I'm going to take a quick dive into the details of some of the accessories she wears with this work dress. So she wears 2 aprons during the movie. One is worn during like happier times, and the other is later on when she's more of a servant than a sister. The first one is actually seen being worn by Haley Atwell, which means it's Ella's mother's apron. But it's actually never seen being worn by Ella's mother in the movie. We pretty much don't see the mother's dresses very often. But can we just take a moment to appreciate those dresses? Haley's costumes are like, you hardly see them, but they're so pretty and good and like, oh, so good. But anyway, the apron is made of a sheer fabric. It's lightly gathered at the waist and is attached to a band which continues around the back and presumably ties in the back. The bottom section of the apron is heavily embroidered in a geometric design with a lot of eyelets making that up. At the very, very bottom, there's a slightly purple like trim attached to that bottom edge, so just an interesting detail. For the second apron, it's more of a heavy-duty looking apron, ready for work apron. It's thickly smocked at the top section and appears to be a heavier fabric with more of a hardier weave to it. The straps attach at the middle of the smocking and tie in the back. The edges of the strap appear to have been whip stitched in place with a darker pink thread. And then we also see the thread in the hem. It looks like just like a very basic stitch securing the hem in place. And that's why you're seeing that red thread kind of poking through. And then this apron is almost as long as her work dress. Next one, the shoes. So very basic flats with a small string bow. The bottoms look like they're probably leather, and then it's edged with what it looks like twill tape. The interesting detail is that they were painted. They weren't dyed or they didn't start off blue. You can see the inside of the shoe that it's not evenly blue. It doesn't stop at a direct edge. Also, when you see young Ella outside her sick mother's room, we see her shoes, and they look like they're the same shoes. Are we supposed to think that her feet stopped growing and she was able to fit in the same shoes as a grown woman? Maybe? Cinderella is about magic shoes, so maybe it would work. I hope you enjoyed this video exploring all the details of this lovely dress, and I will be making a replica of this dress and all the accessories probably in the coming months. So if you'd like to be part of that journey, be sure to subscribe and watch along the way. And also, if you haven't seen it already, I did a 2-part breakdown video of Ella's ball gown, and then I also made the full ball gown, so if you're interested in the making of that dress, be sure to check out the playlist.